Hello everybody, this is Brian here, and I wanted to make a video on the uh, Nintendo 3DS essentially versus the Switch. Now, a lot of people don't seem to understand how outdated the 3DS actually is. Um, a lot of people, I believe, think this way because they're like, well, the 3DS has lasted so long, it can still do stuff and still make pretty beautiful games. I'm not going to argue against that, but it's definitely a limiting factor in game creation these days. Now, by how much, I'm going to go about this through a technical perspective. Now, I'm going to try to explain this through as easy as possible here. So let's take a look here. So the Nintendo 3DS came out in 2011. Um, that is about, looking at that now, it's coming on the sixth anniversary here of the Nintendo 3DS. Um, it has two different processors within it. One of them's in ARM 9 and the other one's ARM 11. The ARM 9 is a single core processor that dates back to 1998. Uh, if you're going to look at it this way, it was already a 10-year-old, 13-year-old processor when this came out, for use of playing DS games. Okay, so it was not meant really as anything other than for backwards compatibility with the DS. And it had an ARM 11 chip that dates back to 2002. So that would have made it a 9-year-old processor when the the system just came out, um, let alone for today. Um, it has a GPU, the Pika 200, that is a 65 nanometer chip. To essentially put that into perspective, AMD currently uses 14 nanometer on their GPUs, and NVIDIA uses 16 nanometer. Um, NVIDIA and AMD are both using FinFET, which is it's not quite 16 nanometer or 14 nanometer, but it's extremely close. Now we know that the new 3DS came out not too long ago. It came out in 2015, at least in the States, but in Japan, of course, it came out in 2014, um, which, fair enough. It's a quad core. So the new 3DS came out, but it was not much too terribly greater. It uses the same GPU, but it's clocked about 2% higher, 204 megahertz versus 200 megahertz. It has a different ARM 11 chip, clocked at about 4 times as high, uh, 804 megahertz versus 268. It does not have the ARM 9 chip that the original 3DS had. This is probably due to cross-cutting, and the system was probably strong enough to emulate the old single core that the DS was, um, which could kind of make it not a full emulation uh, through hardware, but that's nor here nor there. Now back to the ARM 11 chip. It's a quad core instead of a dual core of the original 3DS, which explains its better performance. The final statistic I think really worth mentioning on these systems is the cat on the there we go, the VRAM, which is 10 megabytes on the new 3DS, which is minuscule even in the early 2000s. Um, it's kind of pitiful. The original 3DS had 8, um, which is still pretty far away from current uh, VRAM amounts. Now let's jump into the Switch specs. The Switch, of course, is a much newer system. It came out this year, earlier in March, and a lot has changed really in the last 6 years. take for example the Switch's processor. It's the NVIDIA Tegra X1. The measly 4 cores in the new 3DS seem moot, as the X1 has 8 cores, all clocked at 1.02 gigahertz. If the IPC were the same from the ARM 11 cores to the Tegra cores, the Switch would be 15 times more powerful at the CPU level over the original 3DS. Yeah. So now if we look at if IPC were the same, say, for the new 3DS, it'd be about 2.5 times more powerful than the new one. Now, that doesn't sound too extremely great, 2.5 times, but that's if IPC were exactly the same. And considering that the ARM 11 chip is dated as far back as the early 2000s, IPC would be much better on the Tegra. As mentioned earlier, the VRAM of the new 3DS is 10 megabytes. The Switch has 4 gigs of it. Much faster VRAM, by the way. It's low power DDR4. I don't know if it was even DDR for the original 3DS. To put that into perspective, the Switch has over 400 times the amount of VRAM and faster VRAM at that. Now, we're past more of the technical bits. It's now time to talk more about the games. Now, this is where essentially my script that I've developed kind of ends. Because this is going to be more of it's going to be less of a technical perspective and more of a quality perspective. Games like Breath of the Wild, or future games like Xenoblade 2 will not be possible on the 3DS. Breath of the Wild alone would choke the 3DS. It just wouldn't work. Granted, we're talking about two different systems here, both with different architecture, but the 3DS is really, really, really old, and it's really only good as a portable system. It's not good as a home console like the Switch is. Now, a lot of people would say, well, it's too big to be a pocketable handheld. The Switch doesn't really fit in your pocket very well. But that doesn't really stop phones from getting too terribly big either. So you can't really say these bigger phones, or phablets as I hate to call them, you can't say they're not mobile phones anymore because they're bigger. That doesn't make any sense. It's a portable system just as much as the 3DS is. It just so happens that it also can connect to the TV. A lot of people are preferring to use it as a portable system because it runs games better while undocked than docked. That's due to the lower resolution on the screen, and that's just about it there. Even though it downclocks a little bit lower when undocked. Now, let's say we wanted the new Pokemon game. The new Pokemon game, if it was put on the 3DS, there's not a lot of innovation to be done there. There's not a lot of room for improvement in terms of their engine, which will make the game seem a lot more of just a rehash of the older games. I do know we're talking about Pokemon here, and Pokemon tends to be the same game each time, more or less, but it has a lot of technical advancements from game to game. Each one continually looks better as you go down the line. So looking at it from that perspective, Game Freak is already working on an RPG, a world-renowned RPG on the Switch. I don't think it's something else. It can't be Zelda, because they already made one. I believe they're going to be making a Pokemon game on the Switch. That's a portable game that you can play on the TV. And it will have graphics that are far, far better than the 3DS could ever output. at a smoother frame rate than the 3DS could output. Looking at the screens, say on the 3DS, they're tiny. They're very small screens. And looking at them for an extended period of time can give you eye strain, eye problems down the line. The Switch, on the other hand, has a 6.2-inch display, quite a bit larger, and it's a bit more comfortable to use. The controls are less cramped than the 3DS's. It has proper analog sticks. And it seems like its library is going to continue to grow with more indie games and titles that, see, even the Wii U couldn't get, because the Wii U was using a PowerPC architecture. This is going to be using NVIDIA's ARM-based processor. A modern one at that, a very beastly one at that. So mobile games will be able to be ported over with proper controls. At this point, I think what's really stopping the mobile market from taking over the 3DS or the Switch's market is due to the physical controls. The Switch can play all those mobile games. That's not a problem at all. It has the horsepower behind it. And it has the touchscreen as well. But it also has the physical controls to play the games better. No longer will you have to be like, oh, I guess I'm just going to play a tactics game because there's no way I'm going to be playing a platformer on a touchscreen. That's not an ideal way to go unless you're an endless runner, which Nintendo had to resort to with the only way they could put a Mario game on a mobile device. So, all in all, it's pretty clear that the Switch is going to definitely overshadow the 3DS and replace it entirely, regardless of what Nintendo has been saying. Nintendo's saying, oh no, we're going to keep the 3DS around, as that's going to be the dedicated handheld. But we're going to see very clearly here that the 3DS is going to fade away. And I understand people are like, well, but the PS2 lasted forever too. But yes, it wasn't the modern hardware. It wasn't where all the AAA games went. It's not where the majority of people wanted to play. And that's the same thing that's going to happen with the Switch and the 3DS. The Switch, of course, is going to look pretty attractive considering its price point is at $300. That's slightly more than the Xbox One right now. And it's a portable system, which the Xbox One cannot do. And the 3DS, the new 3DS, is like $250 new. I'm sorry, but that's not worth the money. So, looking at everything as I laid it out, I think that's enough said. So, I'll see you guys on my next video. I know it hasn't been a game video or anything like that. I really hope I could go into that a little bit further. I might do a little more serious topics in the future too. It's just I don't have a lot of time on my hands. I'm doing this really whenever I have free time, which is not a lot. I appreciate whoever would be watching this video very greatly, and I'd like to see you on my next video. Thank you.